Hello, welcome to Only for Your Ears and today's episode 21, The Garden of Paradise, which I've renamed as The Forbidden Fruit. This prince bit off more than he could chew. Let's begin with the structure as usual. We'll start off with a summary and and emphasizing the highlighted points. Then we'll go on to my critical review on how this story plays in society using some of the sentences from the summary, which I digressed with, to frame my review. Then we'll go on to the triggers, the trigger points, which I found certain points that I found triggering through this story. So let's begin with the Garden of Paradise, which I've renamed as the Forbidden Fruit. This prince bit off more than he could chew. The Garden of Paradise is a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen that tells the story of a young prince who embarks on a quest to find the legendary Garden of Paradise, a place of eternal happiness and beauty. I digress. Is there such a place on earth? The tale explores themes of temptation, the pursuit of knowledge, and the balance between good and evil. The prince, driven by a desire for knowledge and understanding, sets out on a journey to locate the Garden of Paradise. I digress. The act of understanding comes more from experience as opposed to knowledge. Along the way, he encounters an enchanting fairy who offers to transport him to the garden if he can resist the temptation she represents. I digress again. The temptation might be more than he can handle. The prince agrees, and the fairy takes him to the east wind. She carries him to the garden. Here's a reflection. Temptation and morality. The story highlights the struggle between temptation and morality. I digress. Why is temptation linked to our moral code? Isn't there such a thing as good temptation, which includes our ability to resist? The prince's journey to the Garden of Paradise represents the quest for knowledge and eternal life. But his inability to resist the princess's allure ultimately leads to his expulsion. This can be seen as a metaphor for the importance of resisting earthly desires and maintaining one's moral compass. Ah, the taboo of the forbidden fruit and the guilt that wrestles with our consciousness. Where does guilt come from? If my actions harm other people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there's reason for guilt. Or sometimes society bows down and projects onto us what they deem to be wrong based on their own upbringing. So sometimes we feel guilty because of other people's projection. But I like the first one. If I have harmed someone intentionally or unintentionally, there's reason to feel guilty. But the second one, not so sure. Upon arrival, the prince is awestruck by the beauty of the Garden of Paradise, which is guarded by four magnificent trees representing four seasons. He meets the lovely princess who resides in the garden and falls in love with her. But of course, I digress. His taste buds have been awakened, but can he resist? This is the test. The prince, however, must overcome several temptations before he can be with the princess, including the tree of knowledge, which bears the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. I digress. The prince will succumb to natural hunger from the juices of exotic beauty. Reflection. The coming of age. The prince's journey can also be viewed as a coming of age. I digress. This is a lopsided test. A young prince coming of age doesn't have the maturity and the experience to do this. He sets out on a quest for knowledge and wisdom, which is a common theme in such stories. However, his failure to resist temptation and maintain his innocence is a reminder of the vulnerability and the fallibility of humans as they mature. I digress. Is this a failure of human beings? What about people that have remained celibate for a while? They haven't failed, but it was his coming of age that was the real problem. I believe maturity can help us with resisting such temptations. Remember the film, The Last Temptation of Christ? He did it, but Jesus is another thing. Despite the best intentions, the prince succumbs to temptation and eats the forbidden fruit. I digress. This is only natural. The prince didn't have the experience to discipline himself. As a consequence, he is cast out of the garden of paradise, and the east wind carries him back to his kingdom. I digress. I actually believe this was an unfair test that was designed to press guilt on him. It was a tough lesson. The prince left with the knowledge he gained, but is unable to return to the garden or be the prince or be with the princess he loves. Reflection. The pursuit of knowledge. The princess's desire to find the garden of paradise and gain immense knowledge reflects the human quest for wisdom and understanding. I disagree, however. The story also suggests that the pursuit of knowledge can be dangerous, as it may lead one to disregard several moral values and face dire consequences. I digress. This is true. Our society is obsessed with book knowledge, which is highly valued. However, wisdom is the street smart of life, the street smarts of life, and the king of resourcefulness. In the end, the prince learns the true wisdom and understanding come from not seeking forbidden knowledge, but from experiencing life and making the right choices. Ah, the power of choice. But is it always the right choice? I guess so. Exactly. The Garden of Paradise serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of succumbing to temptation and the importance of personal responsibility in shaping one's life and destiny. I digress. I don't think the young prince who was on the threshold of becoming of age should have been punished so harshly. But this was a great story, a great fairy tale. It's a hard story to digest because it's about wisdom and coming of age and taking responsibility. The last reflection here, the inevitability of death. The story serves as a reminder of the inescapable nature of death, despite the prince's quest for immortality and eternal youth. He is ultimately confronted by death, who warns him of his impending demise. I digress. This is the reality of life. The desire to be forever young is a fallacy. This theme reinforces the idea that all humans, regardless of their actions or accomplishments, must eventually face death. Sad but true, people. Sad but true. Let's continue. With my critical review on how this story plays in society today. This is a great story that gives a harsh warning to people going through the coming of age, more so from a religious point of view and also a life point of view as well. I have often seen young Christians quickly rush into marriage, and I wondered, yes, I wondered whether it was right or wrong. I wondered if this had to do with true love or not committing the type of sin by having quick and hasty sex mentioned in the tale above, just to avoid God's imagined wrath. I found myself questioning how guilt and temptation influences our lives and the consequences of karma. Where does guilt come from? Again, if my actions harm other people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that is the danger. And this is the question. Or sometimes society bears down and projects onto us what they deem to be wrong based on how they were brought up and religious doctrine. So let's take a look at some situation via films and some real life situations on how this story plays out in society today. Let's look at number one, the first example. Despite his best intentions, the prince succumbs to the temptation and eats the forbidden fruit. I digress. This is only natural. The prince didn't have the experience to discipline himself. As a consequence, he is cast out of the Garden of Paradise, and the east wind carries him back to his kingdom. This reminds me of the last temptation of Christ. And also there's a story in the Bible about Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. And for a long time, the church and the Bible, it seemed, blamed Eve. Eve was the one that lured Adam to bite into the forbidden fruit. But the thing is, if you're going to be an individual, an emancipated individual that's becoming responsible, shouldn't you take responsibility for eating that fruit instead of blaming it on to somebody that for a long time through society and especially in the Christian world and in the religious world, that women were considered minor, not as powerful as men, and vulnerable. Blame it on the baby. That's what they're there for. Blame it on Eve. That's what she's there for. So Adam doesn't have to take responsibility for what he did. But now in today's society, the religious kingdom is also saying, you know, Adam was wrong. The last temptation of Christ looks at all of the temptations Jesus encounters as a grown man, not a boy in his late teens experiencing his coming of age. There's a big difference. Jesus was a mature man. This prince was a boy. So, if Jesus struggled deeply with these temptations, you could just imagine how the prince felt. The film depicts the life of Jesus Christ and his struggle with various forms of temptation, including fear, doubt, depression, reluctance, and of course, lust, the weakness of the flesh. The book and the film depict Christ being tempted by imagining himself engaged in sexual activities, which caused outrage from some Christians. It includes a disclaimer stating this film is not based on the Gospels, but upon the fictional exploration of the eternal spiritual conflict. Like the novel, it was based on the film generated controversy from Christian religious groups at the time of its release, who took issue with its departures from the Gospels narrative. It received positive reviews from critics and some religious leaders, and Scorsese received a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Director. Now, I'd like to talk about the Christians, all right? I am a Christian myself, but I'm not what you call a deeply fixed religious Christian. Now, the Christian's reaction in regard to departing from the book's narrative as being out of touch with today's society. From my observation, the Christian community has been riddled with guilt about what's considered sin within the doctrine. That there are lots of toxics, phony, hypocritical people that project their own fear onto non-religious people. The temptation must come. I believe fear of guilt as a consequence of sin increases the possibility to commit sin, which leads to guilt and compulsive behavior as a punishment to disobeying one's doctrine, a doctrine that isn't necessarily aligned to today's principles. This doesn't mean that you must act without a sense of consciousness in regard to your own personal morals. I think one must act accordingly to one's principles within reason. Freedom to act, touch, feel, speech must be exercised with a sense of responsibility, the freedom of speech. If you want to stand comfortably in your own power and birth the very freedom we desire, we must take accountability for our actions. The Catholic Church has fallen on its knees several times between the death of Pope Paul and I think Pope Benedict, that today's Pope, whom they appointed, is a Jesuit, which has strong liberal leanings and has been a lot more flexible with the church and its doctrines because he realizes that in today's society, the old doctrines, some of the old rules it's not feasible anymore. A woman having 14 children in today's society, that's not feasible anymore. So he's had to be flexible, and God bless him for it. Let's go on to the next part now. of my review. He sets out on a quest for knowledge and wisdom, which is a common theme in such stories. However, his failure to resist temptation and maintain his innocence is a reminder of the vulnerability and fallibility of humans as they mature. I digress. Is this a failure of human beings? What about people that have remained celibate for a while? They haven't failed, but it was his coming of age that was a real problem. I believe maturity can help us with resisting such temptations. I'm reminded of the royal stereotype, the royal family stereotype, which is totally hypocritical. You have Prince Philip and his professional devotion to HRH, Her Royal Highness, but his disloyalty personally was a conflict. He had loved other women, although he was a great father, perhaps better than the Queen. There was no doubt that Philip, Prince Charles, and Prince William all failed terribly when it came to fidelity to their wives. Prince Charles, King Charles, wasn't just unfaithful to Diana, but we just recently found out that he's not only an alcoholic, along with his wife Camilla, but he's had many affairs with several women while being married to his queen. And yet they still want to maintain, and it is phony and it's not right. This is what they did with Diana, and then they realized how hypocritical they really were, that he had to marry a virgin while he, King Charles, was still sowing his wild oats and has been doing it all his married life. So this idea is very sexist and misogynistic. The man can continue doing this, but if a woman does it, it's another thing. So, and they could not, they failed terribly when it came to this. He doesn't possess the moral compass or maturity that was mentioned in the story. Prince William followed in his father's footsteps. Although I really truly believe that William has always been much more advanced and more mature in spirit than his father. But unfortunately, I'm a little disappointed that he's followed that, because I think Catherine, his wife, is a really good, decent woman. The last point that I'm going to make to frame my critical review. Number 3, the prince, driven by a desire for knowledge and understanding, sets out on a journey to locate the Garden of Paradise. I digress. The act of understanding comes with experience as opposed to knowledge, even though the two can work together. The film The Blind Side really came to mind when I thought of this aspect about experience versus knowledge and understanding. I want to talk about his education at the Christian school. Michael Orr came from a very, very deprived background and was fortunately adopted by a family from Memphis that helped him get the education that he needed, helped him stay off the streets, and he became a professional football player that had a great reputation. Unfortunately, the Tuohys and Michael Orr are going through a difficult battle now. But this, the part that I want to talk about is how he went to a Christian school and how he overcame a lack of academic proficiency and graduated with decent enough grades to go to university. At school, they realized he was 98%, he had 98% protective instincts. I want to talk a little bit about this because having this capacity is like being an empath or somebody that has really soft skills. You may not be a very big academic at the beginning, but at the end, his protective instincts helped him when it came to playing professional football, and it helped him when it came to writing his last and final essay, where there was a teacher that was determined to fail him because he had no confidence in him at all. But then Mr. Toohey and his private coach, who helped him pass his exams, started a debate in front of him and said, what do you want to write about? And he goes, I don't know. And then Mr. Toohey, realizing that he has this protective instincts, I think he uses the story of Spartacus, where everybody, or some similar to Spartacus, but not quite Spartacus, where in the end, all these people die because they don't want their leader to die. And if the leader's going to die, then everybody's going to die. It's like saying, I'm Spartacus. Who's Spartacus? I'm Spartacus. Who's Spartacus? I'm Spartacus. Everybody stands up and says, I'm a Spartacus, and we're all going to die together. It's that type of story that he wrote. And he talks about courage. What is courage really anyway? That's what he talks about. And he writes something that is so pure and so from the heart and so philosophical and loaded with such understanding and knowledge, and as well experience, because he comes from the streets and a lot of his friends in the hood have died on the streets. He was one of the lucky ones, and he brings it all together in a delightful essay. And what happens is that he gets to graduate. So this is the end of my critical review. And let's move on to the trigger points. Well, the trigger points I found interesting, and all of them are actual trigger points. Let's look at the first one. Despite his intentions, the prince succumbs to the temptation and eats the forbidden fruit. I digress. This is only natural. The prince didn't have the experience to discipline himself. As a consequence, he's cast out of the garden of evil, garden of paradise, and the east wind carries him back to his kingdom. Now, this did trigger me. As a former Catholic, I felt very triggered by Christians being offended by this narrative. Jesus was created to be our mirror to be our mirror to ourselves. And then through God's doctrine, we would learn how to obey certain behaviors, to live our lives from a good moral code. I was drawn to the Obamacare ACA, which caused tremendous discord amongst the Catholic Church and Christians. You know, religious folk, it's not necessary. Just because you're a religious person, you're not necessarily spiritual. These people wanted to be perceived as pure-hearted and well-intended, but a lot, it's just for show. Sad to say, This is total hypocrisy. And the religious right is so superficial and pathetic. And Trump is having a field day with this. Look, with the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, questions rose about women working in religious institutes were allowed to have access to birth control. And this was considered an outrage. Pardon me. Even though it was common sense. Now, the Pope showed enormous opposition to this when he met with President Obama. Now, this is natural that in today's society that you'd use birth control, and it's not just about making sure that you don't have babies like rabbits, but it also is very good for hormonal treatment. It's very good for the basic natural functioning of the body. And I'm so tired of men. Not only do they, some of these men, not only do they not have relations with women, they want to tell us what we want, what we should do with our own bodies. And they have no idea. We are just a function to produce an heir and a spare for them in some cases. And they don't understand that birth control carries a lot more weight and influence. So the Pope showed his disagreement with the Affordable Care Act when President Obama went to Rome. And he said, look, I don't agree with the writing. I don't agree with the language that women working in religious institutions are allowed to have birth control. And President Obama said, well, I understand your disagreement, but we're going to continue with this because women working within religious institutions approve of this particular measure. What was really funny at the end of that year, somebody who's a Catholic, a strong Catholic, said, I can't believe it. The Pope stood up at Christmas and said, as he looked out, all the large Catholic families, mothers looking very, very worn out and tired with 14 children, he said to women, he said, it's good having children, but you don't have to have children like rabbits, i.e., birth control. The next part I want to talk about is homosexuality. Heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, whoever you choose to make love to or to have sex with. Making love and sex can be considered quite different, but also very similar in some ways if you're making love. But the church has, for a long time been against homosexuality. But now there are several churches, especially here in Vancouver, several churches that are opening their doors to allowing people of transgender, different sexuality to attend church. And I think a lot of it has to do with the finances myself, because of a lot of the gay community and the LGBTQ community, there is a certain fraction that makes a lot of money. And let's face it, people, the church is a business. And that's exactly what it is. It is a business, and they're not stupid. And they're realizing if we want to attract everybody, well, not everybody, let's go backwards. If God loves all of his people, that means he loves all of his people and not just the white privileged, some blacks, some Indians or Asians or whatever. He loves all of his people. So the church finally woke up to that and has been allowing a more open congregation of people from all different persuasions and alternative lifestyle. Thank goodness for that. And even the Pope turned around and said, after the High Court Supreme Judge allowed a particular case to go forward, where it was a gay couple, same-sex couple, and one of them had Lou Gehrig's disease, and Ohio wouldn't allow them to stay and be married. Totally hypocritical as far as I'm concerned. And so they had to leave. And just as they found the next state over to be able to land where they'd be accepted, I think more so in Michigan, the husband died. And they brought this case as if to say, look, we are same sex, we love each other, just the same as a heterosexual couple. We deserve to be treated equally. And as far as I'm concerned, they deserve to be treated as equally as anybody else, as any couple, union, etc. And the Pope agreed. Love is love, after President Obama came out and said this. So things are changing. Slowly but surely. Pardon me. The next part, he sets on a quest for knowledge and wisdom, which is a common theme in such stories. However, his failure to resist temptation and maintain his innocence is a reminder of the vulnerability and fallibility of humans as they mature. I digress. Is this a failure of human beings? Should he feel guilty? Why? Not everybody. And this is true, people. A lot of people, most of the people on the planet, do not come from Jesus's healthy background. He has a mother that has produced immaculate conception. He has a father and a mother and a father that are devoted to him, that loved him. He was the chosen one. He's the example. He's the example of resisting the temptations of the flesh and on and on and on and on and on. But not everybody comes from that background, people. And that's what I want to say. And therefore, this is why I feel that some of the doctrines need to be modernized. So I'm drawn to a particular person and his wife, and talking about immorality and the third party player. Now, this person that I met, I think he's actually not a bad person. I just think he comes from a background where he has been starved of real, true love. And he got married to somebody out of desperation because of finances. I'm not saying he didn't love this person, but he got married for other reasons as opposed to just pure love. And mind you, marriage is a business anyway. And it seems as though their relationship was conducted more from a business point of view and him having many affairs. Pardon me. And she also seems to have had her many affairs too. So in comes me. We get into a friendship, and he decides that he wants to blow it up because he realizes that he likes me more than just a friend and wants to pursue it. Well, I turned around and I said, absolutely not. No, no, no. We're not going to do this. So what my point here is with this person is that both of them, I think, are actually broken people, like a large percentage of people are broken people. And the only way that we're able to mend and heal is if we confront ourselves and realize that we're prepared to do the heavy lifting to overcome the weaknesses of the flesh, where we just sleep with anybody that we want to, or we get into unsatisfying relationships and get into promiscuous situations, not because we're doing it because of we're searching, we want great sex. We're doing it because we're really searching for love. And that's why I say that Jesus came from a really good background, a good, stable background where he received love. He had self love and he received love from other people. He also had enemies. Pardon me. So that's my second one, a second trigger. And this triggered me. This triggered me a lot. But then when I realized, I said, hey, wait a minute. Jesus came from a strong background in this sense. Whereas the person that I used, I'll call him Frank, and his wife, they come from what most human beings come from. Broken people, broken lives, like shattered glasses or shattered glass that has to be put together. We have to go through our lives and learn how to repair the brokenness in our lives. Whereas Jesus didn't have to do that. He only lived for 33 years. And even though he had tremendous difficulties in those areas, in different areas, he always had love. And so he was able to have relationships with people from a very balanced place and in a good way and know his power. The last one is the prince, driven by a desire for knowledge and understanding, set out on a journey to locate the Garden of Paradise. I digress. The act of understanding, more experienced as opposed to knowledge. The film The Blind Side really got to me. I wanted to talk about education and the Christian school and just education in general. A lot of times people are, especially the church, they are so driven, they're so enthralled by the idea of education, academics, but they're not led by the spirit at all. They're not interested in the spirit. They're not led by empathy. Everything is very sort of what I would call on the surface. And I'm reminded when I was thinking about the blind side and education and how he finally passed his exams, when Michelle Obama, well, basically when Barack Obama and Michelle Obama were in the White House, they always talked about how education was key. He said the only reason why we're here in this position is because we had an education. And I was reminded of when Michelle Obama spoke about how, she applied for Princeton and the dean, the dean told her that she wasn't intelligent enough to enter the school. Well, she was determined and she did enter the school. And I can imagine the horror he must have felt, but also the pride when he saw that Michelle Obama was on the edge of becoming the first lady and the first Black woman of the United States to become first lady. And here he was, had the gall to turn around and say that she wasn't intelligent enough. Both Barack and Michelle are overachievers and are first or seconds in their university grades. Both went to Harvard. One of them went to Princeton, and Harvard, but they were overachievers. So it just goes to show that just because somebody isn't an academic on the surface and it doesn't look as though they fit the mold, they can fit the mold and they will. Thank you very much, people. This is the end of today's episode, and I'd like to say thank you for listening. And we're going to close with healing is a lifelong blessing we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong blessing, and gift, I should say, we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Thank you and goodbye. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, send me a bit of love, and subscribe. Goodbye.